One of the repairs I get asked quite a lot about, and I think what a lot of people struggle with, is the replacing the P6 connector, the touchscreen connector. As you can see with this one, the clip is actually being snapped off, so we're going to have a little go at replacing this. First thing I would probably do is remove the little Wi-Fi module. That's going to give you a little bit of room. If you wanted, you could desolder that, but to be fair, what I like to do is actually just pop it off. Now be careful with this, because if you apply too much force, you can actually damage the tracks. But what I like to do, as you can see, just very lightly bend that upwards. And you'll see that that'll just snap off quite easily. The next thing to do is just to clean up the area. So you can just take your soldering iron, and that will allow you to remove any parts of the connector that are still attached. I'm just using a little bit of soldering flux. You can use whichever type you like, and that'll just allow you to separate the points quite nicely. Okay, now that's the first part. You've prepared the board itself. The next thing to do is to get the P6 connector and prepare that as well. The first thing I like to do is to turn them over. As you can see, the four little legs. I like to make sure that they have solder on them. So you can apply again some soldering flux. And with a soldering iron, which has a little bit of solder on there already, not too much, I like to just touch the legs. As you'll see, that'll bring them up to a higher shine, and that'll just ensure they have the thinnest coating of solder on there as well. What you may need to do is just add a tiny bit of solder to these points here, and then that should make things a little bit easier. Then just line up the tracks on the board with the legs of the P6 connector. And hit your ground point. And as you can see, that's now solid, but it's not quite in position. So I'm just going to hit that area again slightly until I'm happy with the exact lineup, which I am there now. I'm then going to apply some solder to the other side. And once that's set in position, I can then solder down the legs. Once you have the P6 in line with the tracks, a good thing to do now is just apply a little bit of extra pressure to the top, and heat the ground points. That'll just lay the P6 flat against the board, which is going to make it a lot easier to connect your legs to the correct tracks. The next thing you're going to want to do is to solder the connector legs to the tracks of the board. To do this, you need to be very careful. Make sure you don't have any surplus solder on your iron. And what we're going to do is just go over the tracks, just go over the legs, just lightly with the tip of the solder iron. And what that'll be doing is melting the solder on the underside of the legs, and soldering that to the tracks of the board. That's why before we were putting a little bit of solder on the underside of the legs. Now you have to be very careful at this point. If you have too much solder on the end of your iron, if you get that in between the legs, it's virtually impossible to remove that without removing the P6 and starting all over again. Once you've gone over the legs a few times and you're happy that the connections have been made, the next thing you want to do is, using your multimeter, is to test that the pins actually buzz out, that a connection is made. So if you take your test pin and just place it on the first leg, and then if you test this point here, check your multimeter, and you should see a small resistance there. Before you move on to the next pin, just move on to the next test point below. Now, reading your multimeter, there should be no reading on the screen, and this will confirm that you haven't bridged any of the pins. So do that for each of them before you move on. So I'm looking at my multimeter now, and that's buzzing out. There's no reading there. Third pin and third test point's buzzing out. Yeah, third pin and fourth test point, no reading. So by the looks of it, I've done that well. So the next thing is basically just to test it and make sure that it does work. If it doesn't work, just double check your connections, go over these again with your soldering iron, and just sort of wiggle them around, but be very careful not to have excess solder on and not to bridge any of the points there. As well, remember that most of the connector is plastic, so you can't apply heat for too long, otherwise you'll melt the connector, and again you're going to have to get yourself another connector there. One last thing I would say to note, what you can do, you can fit this and think that you've done a good job. All your pins may buzz out, but what you'll find after you've put it all back together on your touch screen has been installed, it might work the first time, but then when you turn your DS Lite off and turn it back on a couple of times, it may stop working. The reason for that is that you just haven't quite made a strong enough connection with the pins. So take your time with those, with your soldering iron, and just go over them a few times just to make sure that you have done that. I mean, this is a pretty tricky repair, so if it takes you a few times to get the hang of it, you know, don't be ashamed of that. And as always, just take your time with this thing. You know, if you rush it, you're going to melt things, and it's going to cost you time and money. Good luck, and I hope that helps you.